Part 3 is again going to be about evidence. And then part 4 we'll talk about, okay, what does all this imply? How are all these things that are all impossible by the classical view possible? How does it work? We'll be doing that in part 4. But one more battery of information. Well, one of the things which is actually classic, and you can find it easily on the internet or elsewhere, is that you've got all of these debunking sources that are usually self-proclaimed debunking sources, like Randy the Magician and things like that. And like you go on maybe Wikipedia or something, and they'll describe maybe some phenomenon that is based in this other paradigm that we're obviously listening to, and then they'll have on the debunkers, and it always amazes me that they'll quote on Wikipedia, for example, the amazing Randy, who's a magician, not a scientist, and he's rendering opinions on these things without having gone through these experiments himself. He just renders an opinion as to how this was done without any evidence whatsoever. But you know, attempting to debunk all these things. Anyway, one of the common objections to things that are based in consciousness is people doing experiments, and like I'm sure Randy the Magician, you know, oh, I tried that, didn't work for me, it's just baloney, you know, and all it means is that they don't understand all of what it took to make it work. But I really love this quote by William James, the famous Harvard psychologist and lecturer. If you wish to upset the law that all crows are black, you mustn't seek to show that all crows are. It's enough if you can prove one single crow to be white. And that's true. You know, if you've got evidence out there that's clear evidence that something is true, you know, the fact that a whole bunch of other people can't manage to do it themselves doesn't mean that it isn't true. Like spoon bending. I mean, you know, I attended one of Jack's spoon bending parties early on, when I was early on this process. I didn't manage to bend a spoon, but plenty of other people there did, and there's no question that it's a real phenomenon, you know. But all it was, presumably, is just I wasn't at a level where I could get out of my own way well enough to do that yet, but that's okay. So anyway, we're going to show you a bunch more white crows. Glenn Rhine, back to Glenn Rhine, some more work by Glenn Rhine. We've already been through his background. Brilliant scientist. He did some work, has been doing some work recently, in which he was proving that, in fact, you can influence DNA by intention, which is really quite a fascinating subject. It's well known in scientific circles, people doing research on DNA. The DNA molecule, which looks sort of like a corkscrew, it's, as you see in the picture there, the upper part of the picture looks sort of like that. It's an idealization, it's a drawing, because when you look at the electron microscope images, they're usually much messier than that. But it's well known that when DNA begins to unwind, that's a process that precedes cell division. And DNA winding is a process that's associated with DNA repair. And as I said, that's not something that just Glenn Rhine knows. That's well accepted in the world of DNA, the scientific study of DNA. So those things are known. Glenn Rhine set up some experiments which demonstrated the ability to wind or unwind human DNA samples at will by focusing such an intention on the samples, that is, either intending that they wind or that they unwind, and on generating at the same time electrocardiogram coherence, property of coherence in those traces, by maintaining positive emotional states. That is, if you maintained a positive emotional state, which would produce a coherent ECG trace, and a coherent heart field, if you will, which is what heart math, which he formerly was with, that's what they're all about, looking at heart fields. If you maintain positive emotional states, that would generate ECG coherence, and if at the same time you intended the DNA samples to wind or unwind, you could actually make them do that, and they could prove that. And there are, standard analytical techniques using UV spectroscopy and things which can tell when DNA has been unwound or whether it hasn't in DNA in a solution, carried in a solution. And so what they did initially was they took some human DNA and they put it in an aqueous solution, just had the person hold it in their field, or just put it in their field. And then they would set this intention, and in maintaining a positive emotional state, they could cause it to wind or unwind. Which bore lots of significance with regard to, again, the idea of energy, so-called energy healers or mental healers or whatever. How is it that they could be causing healing or things like this? Well, it's shown that their own field can do that. Further experiments, though, demonstrated the ability to do that, but at a distance of more than half a mile away. So, which actually, that might really cause you to scratch your head, because usually when people draw the human aura, I mean, it maybe goes out 30 feet, 40 feet, whatever, to the outer layers or everything. Actually, it goes broader than that, but they're not detecting at that point. But, but it does say something about thought, and the fact that thought is somehow a non-local phenomenon. Thought can create effects at a distance, just like remote viewing, being able to access information from around the world and things like that. Thoughts and information per se have a property of non-locality. The distant experiments, as I say, implied that the necessary ECG coherence influence mechanism was not electromagnetic, because electromagnetic fields, as we know, have inverse square relationships, and they would be becoming weaker and weaker as you moved away, but this was unaffected by distance. So it wasn't, clearly wasn't, even though an electrocardiogram is actually measuring energy, it's actually being affected by a kind of a field that is not energetic. And we'll talk about that when we get to the physics part of it. I want to discuss some of the work of Joie Jones, the late Joie Jones, and of University of California, Irvine. Joey was a close friend of mine, and I knew him for years, and he did some absolutely phenomenal work. He specialized in physics initially in his master's and his bachelor's, master's, and PhD at First University of Texas, and then Brown for his PhD. Brown was my alma mater as well, so we had numerous things in common. And became professor of radiological sciences at the University of California, Irvine. He became an expert in medical imaging, acoustics, ultrasonics, and in the physiological effects of electromagnetic fields and ultrasound radiation and its physiological effects as well. This guy was quite a high achiever. He was on the presidential Science and Technology Advisory Committee for Jimmy Carter, advising the president on the subject of science and technology. He was named to a special committee that he served on for global warming for the Secretary General of the United Nations, who was seeking potential solutions to the global warming issue, and he was on a special committee to look at alternative means of trying to combat that issue. He's written more than 300 technical papers, 4 books, and had about 50 patents issued to him. Some of the work which he did, which I was really fascinated by, was stimulation of acupoints. In the mainstream scientific community, there was a great reluctance to accept the whole idea of acupuncture and the whole Eastern thought on, meridians, right, thanks, that's what I'm looking for. The existence of meridians and the fact that life force was flowing through those meridians, and you would get blockages, and then you could unblock the blockages via acupuncture with silver needles put in the right spot. So he first off, in this work, attempted to determine whether there was any scientific basis for the whole business of acupoints. Actually, he had been trained in acupuncture himself, so he knew a lot about it, and was fascinated by it. He tried stimulating acupoint UB67, which is in the subject's foot. I believe it is in the side of a toe. Stimulated it with an acupuncture needle, and according to traditional Chinese medicine, this relates to the eye. And what he did was he put the person on a bed and ran the person's head into an MRI, into the middle of an MRI, and first of all, without any acupuncture or anything, just shined a light in their eye to see what part of the brain lit up in the MRI. And that part of the brain that lit up is what's classically viewed as the visual cortex, proved that in fact it was working that way, and what the MRI looked like when you stimulated the visual cortex. And then he proceeded to stimulate acupoint UB67, which was supposed to relate to the eye, and lo and behold, he found that same point in the brain lit up just fine in the MRI, and demonstrated that even though it was very incredulous to the medical community that in fact by poking a needle in somebody's toe you could get their visual cortex to light up, he proved that in fact it absolutely does. And then he carried it a step further, and instead of stimulating the point with an acupuncture needle, he stimulated it with an ultrasonic transducer and used ultrasound to stimulate that point. And sure enough, it lit up just fine, stimulating the same point with ultrasound. One of the things that was really fascinating and flew in the face of any medical theory for how this works, since it was classically viewed that, well, if you're going to stick something in somebody's toe, you're using the nervous system somehow to influence the brain. He proved that absolutely that wasn't the case, because when he used ultrasound, he now had an electronic signal that he could that was feeding the transducer, that he could tell how long it took between when he put the ultrasound in and when the visual cortex lit up. And the fact of the matter was, it was more than 100 times faster than neural response. So whatever was going on, it wasn't the nervous system that was being used in order to stimulate the visual cortex. So, it was less than 0.8 meters a second time. He couldn't even tell. It might have been, even from his point of view, instantaneous. He could only measure down to that smaller level, but it was clearly faster than that. But he couldn't really tell how fast. He just knew that it was more than 100 times faster than neural response. So all of this tended to show some very fascinating things, and also at the same time confirm a traditional Chinese medicine doctrine that was more than 1,000 years old, which is interesting in its own right. How do they know how to do that? Yeah, interesting. How do they know that the toe, had something to do with the eye? He found that there were also an identical response that he could get when he used pranic healers, which are a certain form of energy healers, to stimulate the acupoint mentally. They would focus on the acupoint, and he did it remotely. In some cases, long distances away, he could have them envision the person's toe. I don't know whether he gave them a photo of it or whether he just had them envision their toe. But at any rate, they were many, many miles away, and they could get the visual cortex also to light up remotely by just focusing on stimulating the point with pranic energy, what they referred to as pranic energy, which I would submit to you is not actually energy from a physics point of view. But anyway, that was quite fascinating work as well. And he also did work mapping the acupoints using ultrasonic imaging so that he could actually find that, in fact, acupoints are not constant in either size or location. They're approximate, but they move around and they change size, which is the reason why actually people that are good acupuncturists have to be very intuitive. They have to be able to intuit where to put that needle and where to stimulate, because it moves around and gets bigger or smaller without a complete understanding of why or when. He also was quite fascinated by the whole business of pranic healing, and he became trained as a pranic healer by a master probably the guy's name is Accu. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank at the moment. Master Cho Accu. And he was trained as a pranic healer, and he decided he wanted to study this, and the healer, the sequence which he was trained by were that the healer gives blessings and gratitude to their teachers first, and expresses gratitude, and perceives the aura of the subject that's desiring the healing, and perceives, and obviously you have to have some intuitive capability to do this, cultivated, perceives the absence of certain colors in the subject's auras and that are indicative of illness. And the healer then projects what they believe is pranic energy or life force or whatever of the appropriate missing colors into the aura of the subject with the intent to heal and balance the subject. So that's the basis that he was taught. And he decided to try this phenomenon on in a scientific test, and he was using what are called HeLa cells, which were at that time very commonly used and had been for decades for doing testing. Well, HeLa cells were actually cells of a woman named Henrietta Lacks that were taken from her without asking, actually, and used, and had been used for decades, since the 1950s. Nowadays, I think there's some rules about using Henrietta Lacks' cells without her permission, but in those days, it was a commonly accepted means of measuring effects on cells. And so he took a bunch of HeLa cells, which had been cultured ever since Henrietta had left the earth, I'm sure, a long time ago, and he gamma radiated the cells, and all of the cells, both the controls and the ones that were to be targets in the experiments. He did 520 experiments of this type, so it wasn't just one or two experiments that all showed the same trends. He used 10 different pranic healers, and the controls had, with that amount of gamma radiation, about a 50% survival rate, which was classic for that degree of gamma radiation. That was what was expected. He got better than 90% survival rate for the healed cells that the pranic healers were attempting to heal of having been gamma radiated and killed. And the effect was shown to be independent of distance and independent of shielding. You couldn't shield it. You could, put it in a Faraday cage or shield it with whatever you wanted. No effect. He went to publish this in Nature and Science, and he found he could not get this work published. As I was saying earlier, if something's revolutionary, it becomes very difficult to get it published. Even though he's done 520 experiments and all that, and he had 5 Nobel Prize winners write supportive reviews of that work. And Science, the organ of the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, refused to even review the work, despite 5 Nobel Prize winners writing supportive reviews. And Nature presumably reviewed it, but they refused to publish it. So that's how tough it can be to get this kind of work out there, and it's one of the reasons why the public doesn't hear about this kind of stuff. I'd like to talk now about John Neely. I know John from Penn State. I've known him for a number of years, and he has a excellent history and reputation. He's an MD from Penn State College of Medicine, and did residencies and fellowships at the University of Minnesota, and has been practicing and still practices pediatric hematology and oncology. He was practiced at Cincinnati Children's Hospital and Penn State's Children's Hospital, and he's also certified by the American Board of Integrative Holistic Medicine, et cetera, et cetera. And he is today still, in addition to his pediatric work on a routine basis at Penn State Hershey Medical Center and Lehigh Valley Hospital, he's a professor of pediatrics at Penn State College of Medicine. Before I talk about the work, I'm going to introduce the other element of the work. This is Jixing Li, who's a very close friend of mine. We're virtually like brothers. And Jixing Li is a very high-level Qigong master. And he was trained initially in China in martial arts and Qigong, and then to start off at the time he was 5 years old and grew up being trained, and eventually developed notoriety there, and went to Japan and was solely licensed by the Institute of Qigong Science and Research, which is a Chinese organ for issuing Qigong licenses, and he was solely licensed to issue Qigong licenses in Japan because of his level of expertise. And he lived in Japan many years, and he was renowned in Japan for healing and for unique rejuvenation abilities. Master Li not only was able to heal people from a plethora of physical issues, he is able to take somebody and work on them for about 2 months and literally make them about 20 years younger in every way, shape, and form. Not just superficially, but literally about 20 years younger. He showed me at one point some photographs of a young woman, a Japanese woman. She had been, I believe, in her 50s when he first started working on her. He wouldn't let her take He wouldn't let him take her picture to start with because Japanese are very face-oriented, meaning not the face, but image-oriented, and she was embarrassed by her ugliness and her aging. But after he started to work on her and she started to improve, then she did let him take a picture that was partway through the process. And she was Amerasian, and in Japan, being a mixed race like Caucasian and Japanese was looked down on by the Japanese more than they would look down on a Caucasian. I mean, an Amerasian was kind of down below, pure races. And anyway, it was her desire to look younger, and he worked on her for 2 months, and he showed me the after pictures, and she looked like a woman that was maybe in her late 20s. And not only did she look like that, she was now looked much more Caucasian and not simply Amerasian, so that she was delighted by the fact that people wouldn't look down on her anymore. And additionally, she had not only transformed, in terms of superficial, how she looked, but she had gotten back her cycles, which she had passed menopause when he started to work on her in the 50s, and she had her cycles back, and she was in every way a young woman. But he was unique in that respect in Japan. And my understanding has been from the exposure that I've had over the years that Qigong masters are kind of in a certain sense in sort of three classes. I'm sure more ways to classify them, but the first class of a master would be able to create lots of different phenomena and heal in many cases. The next class up would be able to rejuvenate and make people literally younger, and that's very rare. And the highest class were reputed to be able to literally raise people from the dead. And those obviously are even fewer and farther between. I did meet one Qigong master that might have been at that level, actually, but I'll save that story for later. That could raise the dead. Anyway, at one point he was on Japanese TV, 5 national TV networks, and he worked for half an hour on a woman's face, half of her face, and by the end of the half hour you could see the difference in aging between one half of her face and the other. I'm sure he worked on the other half after they ended the program, but he's quite a phenomenon. Anyway, Master Li was desirous of cooperating with scientific efforts in the scientific community to show the validity under scientific circumstances of Qigong, and asked me if I could assist him with finding somebody to cooperate with him. And my dear friend Rustam Roy and I talked about it, and he ended up identifying John Neely to work with him, and John did agree to work with him. And what they did was look at destruction of cancer cells by remote intention, and they used a human sarcoma line, which he did a lot of work with, and that was in nutrient cultures. Before any treatment, both the target and control cells grew identically, and then Master Li focused his intention on the target cells. And this was the experimental setup here, and whoops, got by myself. This is an incubator, and the sample that Master Li was focusing on was up here, the target cells and nutrient, and there was a mirror facing up underneath them, and then the controls were down here, and all of them were held at the same temperature for the same amount of time and same amount of humidity and all that stuff. And in this case, Master Li was in Mountain View, California. The cells in the laboratory were in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Li never even met John Neely. They talked by telephone, and they worked out everything by email and telephone through his translator. At that time, he spoke very little English. And they worked out the experimental setup, and then at the proper time, Li focused from Mountain View, California on the target cells. He had a picture of the target cells in the incubator setup, and he focused on them. And these were being destroyed from all the way from California. Again, flies in the face of what's classically viewed to be possible. Melinda Connor, I've also known for quite a few years now. She was she has background and degrees in counseling, psychology, and clinical psychology, and was educated at University of San Francisco, California Coast University, and then spent a number of years at University of Arizona, and became director of the Optimal Healing Research Program and the Lab of Advanced Consciousness and Health at University of Arizona. She now is on the faculty of Langara College, teaching holistic health studies, and is an adjunct professor at Everest College and Akamai University in Hawaii. She's also CEO of the National Foundation for Energy Healing, and has had a professional healing practice for 27 years. Written numerous scientific papers, I'm not sure how many, but I know numerous, and 5 books. Well, she did some work, set up to do some work in demonstrating the capacity of non-local healing. And she's a healer, and has been for 27 years. This was a fully medically documented case where the university, some people in the university found a case which was considered unhealable, and documented it all. It involved a paraplegic with a spinal cord injury to T6. She's a clairvoyant healer, meaning that she can directly perceive auras, and she can perceive the subject all the way down to the cellular level. She can actually mentally perceive what's going on in the subject at the cellular level. If you wanted an interpretation of that, I would tell you it's because she's connecting with her omniscient level of consciousness, her highest level of consciousness. Anyway, she sends the appropriate, what she would call energy, what I would call not energy, but information, to the subject. And she worked on the subject. She never met the subject before or afterwards. She worked on him from 1,700 miles distant, and these were the results. These were, this was on August 23rd, August 27th, I beg your pardon, 2003. Here you can see the spinal cord injury. Where the white is missing is where the spinal cord is missing there. And this was by January 27th, when, which is 6 months later, in 2004, you can see the entire spinal cord was restored. That's an MRI. Those are actual MRIs of the spine. Howard Hall, another case of a person investigating and proving a fascinating phenomenon. Has a PhD in experimental psychology from Princeton and a PsyD for clinical psychology from Rutgers. Spent time in work at Rutgers Medical School and Case Western Medical School, and has had a fellowship in substance abuse, taught hypnosis at Penn State and Case Western. Is a professor of pediatrics still at Case Western Reserve Medical School, and professor of psychiatry also there. Is on the staff of Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital and University Hospitals of Cleveland. Howard became aware of a phenomenon in the Mideast of Sufi, what's called DCBD, or deliberately caused bodily damage, wound healing, where it was Sufis at times would demonstrate. A dervish would take like a meat hook and put it through their body, or a skewer and put it through their hand, or various things, hammering spikes into their skull, things like that, and then remove them and demonstrate virtually instantaneous wound healing. And he thought this was absolutely fascinating. And he went to Iraq to observe this, and he did observe it, and he got a Midwestern Sufi school to agree to cooperate with him to allow this to be done under medical supervision and hospital conditions. And according to their religious belief, the dervish has to obtain permission from the Sheikh Master in order to do this, and did in fact get that permission, not only to demonstrate it, but to demonstrate it in the United States in a medical setting. Typically, this is something where they appear to experience no pain and there's virtually instantaneous healing. So a demonstration was set up by Howard Hall at a radiological facility in Cleveland. A 0.38 centimeter by 13-inch long unsterilized skewer was used for the experiment. The event was videotaped by a film crew, so there were numerous people there as the film crew. And, you know, since Howard was an expert on hypnosis, he wanted to make sure this wasn't just mass hypnosis or something, that in fact something really was happening. So they were videotaping it and everything else. There were scientists there, healthcare professionals, emergency medical technicians present. Obviously, they had the dervish to sign a complete waiver, and then they proceeded. It was the first time this kind of a demo had been done in the U.S. by this Sufi school, so they hadn't tried this before, sending one of their dervishes over here and doing it. This was a first. It was the first time that a DCBD demonstration had been done by this dervish. I mean, he had been trained there, but he'd never put a skewer through himself or any of that. He was a product of the school, but he'd never done it before. And it was the first time that school had had anybody do a demonstration that was more than a few hundred miles from the master. In this case, the event was being done thousands of miles from the master, who was in Iraq. And it was also the longest duration of the DCBD injury that they'd ever tried. Usually it's typically about a half a minute. They put something in, they pull it out, and that's it. In this case, the injury was sustained for 35 minutes before it was taken out. This is the dervish here with a electroencephalographic net on his head with sensors looking at his brain waves, and this is him with a skewer right through his cheeks. He opened his mouth inside so that he didn't hit his teeth and everything, and went through one cheek and out the other cheek. And and of course all the medical profession saw him do this and looked him all over, checked in his mouth and everything. Here's the skewer through there. Here's an X-ray showing the skewer going through his head, and everything. And they X-rayed it from multiple areas, multiple directions. There's no question that this really happened. And the radiological film and the video certainly documented that there was no fakery going on here. There was no pain experienced, as far as they could tell, either from the evidence of him or any physical evidence before, during, or after the event. On removing the skewer, there was a very small trickle of blood on one cheek, which was immediately stopped by gauze compression in moments. They put a piece of gauze on, then in a few moments they pulled it off, and nothing left. No evidence of any harm. The dervish had blood samples taken before and after. They showed no deviation in the blood samples versus those of 3 controls. Other people having their blood taken going through the same thing, but without a skewer going through them. One of the things that they decided to try also, Howard decided to try, was to take a random number generator, also called a random event generator, since he knew that consciousness was relevant here, and that coherence seems to affect the performance of random number generators. He actually put a random event generator in the room, and during the period when they stuck this thing through him and took it out, and indeed it did become non-random. It wasn't very long, it was only 35 minutes, but to the probability of 70 parts by 70, 0.07%, I'm sorry, 7%. 7% possibility that it was random, that the random event generator, it was a very short trial, but during insertion of the skewer. And the Princeton Engineering Anomalies research lab had projected that in fact that would happen because of the field of consciousness being occurring, coherent field. The Sufi DCB healing claims were fully validated in the demo, and half an hour after the demo, the dervish had dinner with 7 other witnesses. So he was completely unharmed. Quite amazing. According to the classical view, all that's impossible. And I'm sure there are lots of debunkers out there trying to imagine, all these people being bribed. Wasn't the case. It worked. Wayne Jonas, another phenomenon that we're going to be talking about here that relates to consciousness. Wayne Jonas is an MD from Wake Forest School of Medicine. He was director of the Medical Research Fellowship, a Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, director of the Office of Alternative Medicine for the National Institute of Health. He was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Medical Corps until his retirement. He's a fellow in the American Academy of Family Physicians and adjunct professor to the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences, and is a professor of family medicine at Georgetown University, and also president and CEO of Samuel Wiley Institute. He's held leadership positions in the World Health Organization, the White House Commission for Complementary Alternative Medicine, on the edit boards of 8 major journals and scientific advisory boards of 6 national and international organizations, and received 4 major awards. So this guy's a phenomenon. I've met Wayne Jonas. I've seen his presentations. He's an amazing guy, and he's the real McCoy. He studied, did a lot of work looking at studies of the placebo effect in what he prefers to say, to call rather than the placebo, meaning in context effect. Generally speaking, the range of individual effectiveness varies, but like the U.S. treatment of peptic ulcers in 117 group trials varied from 0 to 100% and 20 to 60% typical. Interestingly, in a German control group in the same trials, there were 60% effective, where they were 20 to 60% in the U.S. in the same trials. In Denmark, it was only 20%. In Brazil, it was only 5%. And one of the things that is now known, and this is known by the pharmaceutical industry, is that the color of a pill, which really has nothing to do with the medical function of a pill per se, the color of a pill turns out to have a major difference in its effectiveness in different markets. And so they'll take a pill for one country and it might be red, but in another country that pill isn't very effective there, so it's blue in that country. And in another country it's yet another color, white. In some countries it's bigger, in other countries it's smaller. And all of these things actually seemingly would have nothing to do with the medical function, but had to do apparently with consciousness effects, or what Jonas called meaning and context effects. Many medications that are popularly marketed, according to Jonas, actually only work for a fraction of the population, and the rest of the population they don't work. But that usually isn't talked about. In surveys published in 2008, 50% of internists and rheumatologists prescribed medications they regarded as placebos. 50% of them were doing that. And placebos versus the condition being treated. That is, they were, they might prescribe something that for a given problem that was certainly not related to that problem, but normally might have been good for a stomach ulcer, and you're prescribing it for a heart condition or something like that. And they were doing that purposefully because they had gotten to the point where there, in the medical profession, were some ethical problems where if you knew something was a placebo and you said, you know, this is a medicine, that was a no-no, you know. And of course, if you tell them it's a placebo, then possibly, you know, if you affect the whole effectiveness of it. So what they would do, 50% of these people were prescribing placebos, but they were actually other medications, other than one that had anything to do with the effect. This was a very interesting large-scale acupuncture study that Jonas talked about for treating arthritis pain, where they were looking at arthritis, and they were looking at both traditional acupuncture and sham acupuncture, and the conservative, more classical medical therapy. And and at week 13 with this trial, here was the success rate over here, considered to be, you know, for example, this is 50% effectiveness over here. So at week 13, the acupuncture was about 50% effective with the clinical trial, and the conventional therapy was only about 27% effective. But interestingly, the sham acupuncture was almost the same effectiveness as the acupuncture. And then here's out here, by week 26, the sham and the acupuncture were about the same, and the conventional one was just slightly better by the end of week 26. So either a sham that pretended like it was acupuncture but wasn't, where they, for example, put the needle in completely the wrong spot intentionally, or didn't actually use the needle at all, or whatever, but the person thought they did. You know, there was very little difference between the acupuncture and the sham acupuncture, but a big difference between them and the classical approach. It says something about consciousness here. The results are found to be similar with similar studies that they did for the same types of things with back pain, neck pain, and headache. So it wasn't just arthritis. Then this was interesting. For surgery for the treatment of angina, you know, blocked heart artery, there were 2 randomized studies that were done, which became well known. Back in the 50s and early 60s, the standard for treatment of angina was called bimal surgery, and it was bilateral internal mammary artery ligation, where they would, I've forgotten exactly what the process was, but anyway, that was the standard. And they did 2 randomized studies and found that the sham surgery, where they just opened the person up and then stitched them up again and didn't even do the surgery, had a 70 to 80% effectiveness, just as the mainstream surgical procedure did, which caused them to stop doing that. The medical profession didn't like that very much, and so they went to something else, which was coronary artery bypass surgery, which interestingly had the same effectiveness rate, 70 to 80%. Nobody actually has done a sham study of that, but I know that Jonas is highly suspicious that it would come out at the same 70 to 80%. But those are actually published in the New England Journal of Medicine and the American Journal of Cardiology. So, I mean, this is known in the medical profession, but the public doesn't really hear about this. Kevin Chen, I know Kevin, I've known him for quite a few years, and he was educated originally in China and then at Peking University, and then came to Penn State, got his PhD there in psychology and statistics. and did studies on healthcare policy and management at Columbia, and became an assistant professor at the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Columbia. And when I first met him, he was at University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, and he was associate professor of the Department of Psychiatry, and an associate professor for integrative medicine. He's now director of research at the Qigong Institute, and he was named research professor of the year by the Qigong Summit in Washington, D.C. in 2000. He's published more than 60 scientific papers. When I first met Kevin, it was when he had hosted this woman, whose name is Sun Chulin. She doesn't speak English. She's a well-known figure in China from the Chinese Geology University in Beijing. But she came to a major university, was invited to a major university in the U.S. To discuss her work in revitalizing and sprouting denatured seeds. And she had done many of these experiments in the Far East, in China and in Taiwan and in Japan, before she came to that major university. And I was invited as one of 8 people who were present when she was there to visit this major university. And what she was known for was being able to take a seed and sprout it in a very short period of time. And as a matter of fact, the seed that she's holding there was an example of a peanut that she sprouted in minutes to a sprout of the length that you can see there by holding it in her hand and focusing on it. And she had done many of these experiments with fully denatured seeds, and by fully denatured I mean stuff that from a classical point of view was as dead as a post. I mean, these were typically either peanuts that had been microwaved or had been boiled, and so their sprout rate was 0. Normally they were dead. And I had alluded that I had met someone that might be at the level of a Qigong master who could raise the dead, and this would be her. I met her. I spent a day with her there with the other people. One of the participants was a professor of horticulture at that major university, and she agreed to do some tests. When she first agreed to meet with us, she said that she didn't want a large number of people there, and she didn't want people that weren't open-minded there, because that actually affects the coherence of the field. And but she didn't mind if they were skeptics, healthy skeptics, but she wanted them to be open-minded. So there were only 8 of us there, counting her and her translator, and counting Kevin Chen for 5 of the rest of us. And one of us was a professor of horticulture. Well, she agreed to do some tests over at the Department of Horticulture in that university. And so they had set up a test where they took a bunch of flower seeds from a single bag that they had, and they put them in different petri dishes on blotters and gave them all the same amount of water and everything. And they had some that were controls and some that she worked on. And she was allowed to hold the petri dish and work on them, put her hands on them, but everybody was standing. We were all standing around her watching her the whole time, and she's focusing on them. And she worked on them for a little while and then put them down. And they then took all of them and put them in an incubator under identical conditions of temperature and time. They did the incubations, and after we left, the horticulture professor emailed us and told us what the results were. The results were that the seeds that she did not look at that were the controls, had 0% sprout rate. And she was not told that they were non-viable seeds. But in fact, the bag of seeds was more than 20 years old, and the horticulture professor knew that they had already tested seeds from this bag of seeds, and they got 0 sprout rate. So from his point of view, it was an interesting test of denatured seeds. And sure enough, the controls had 0% sprout rates. Hers had 27% sprout rate. The controls, when you pulled off the covers, they smelled rotten. Hers, when you pulled off the covers, they smelled fresh. So she did, in fact, manage to sprout seeds that apparently were non-viable. And there were quite a few different samples that were tested and got those results. Well, afterwards, I said to the professor, I met him a few months afterwards, and I said, "Are you going to publish these results?" Well, no, I want her to come back again and do it again. Well, this guy had, he was near retirement, and I'm sure he talked with some of his cohorts who said, "You're what? You're doing what? You got to do this again." Well, she'd come all the way from China, so she didn't come back again. But we did watch videos of her. I know that I know Kevin Chen very well, and they had done these kind of experiments with these denatured seeds where she sprouted them in minutes, and we watched the videotape of her doing that, sprouting it to about 4 inches in length in a few minutes. And you could actually see on the petioles, they had actually secretly marked on the petioles of the peanut, the two halves of the peanut, that it was split into when it sprouted, a little code, and sure enough, those petioles were still clinging to it, shrunken down as the thing had sprouted, and with the same code on it. And she's done that kind of experiment. And she said, well, there were 2 occasions where she apparently had. She said one was when she was a little girl. They gave her a rabbit that had been crushed, and it was dead, and she worked on it, and it came back to life. And then she said she was also at a state dinner at one point where they served shrimp. And in China, when they serve them, they're whole shrimp, and they got the antennas on them and the eyeballs and everything. And she took one of the cooked shrimp off of the plate, which was red and had been boiled and everything, or steamed, whatever. And she started working on it and turned it back green and had it crawling around the table by the time she was done. So, I asked her if she'd ever tried this on a person, and she said she had not. But anyway, those things could have been stories. I doubt it based upon the data, that I saw. But anyway, it was an interesting phenomenon, and I met her personally, and I think it was legitimate. And I know the professors at that major university very well, both the host and the one in the horticulture department. Another case I'd like to talk about is Pim van Lommel. Pim is an MD from University of Utrecht in Holland, and he's a specialist in cardiology, which he studied at Utrecht and elsewhere in Utrecht, and also London, echocardiology, and worked as a cardiologist for many, many years at Rhine State Hospital in Arnhem, Holland. And he became the co-founder of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, which is a very interesting area. He published the definitive Dutch study on near-death experiences in the well-known medical journal Lancet, and was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by the President of India at the World Congress on Clinical and Preventive Cardiology. He's written a best-selling book and lectures around the world on the relationship between consciousness and brain function. It was really interesting to look at this cardiac arrest case study. In his work, they encountered a lot of cardiac arrest people and tried to revitalize them. And some of them they were successful with and some not. There were, in the study, they looked at 344 consecutive cardiac arrest cases in this hospital. All of them were pronounced clinically dead, and 509 of them experienced successful resuscitations. And you might say 509, there were only 344 cases, but some of them were multiple times. And it was very interesting. 18% of those people could remember what they were doing while they were clinically dead. They could remember having experiences and describing their experiences while they were clinically dead, while they had no brain waves and no heartbeat. And, they're classically armchair arm wavers out there that say, oh, it had to do with anoxia and loss of oxygen from the brain. Baloney. I mean, they had them all instrumented. There was no oxygen to the brain. There were no brain waves, no brain function, nothing, and no heartbeat either. And he became quite fascinated by the fact that there were 18% of them that could tell you what they were doing at that time. And in numerous studies around the world that have been done now of this phenomenon, often the people will tell you that their experience was being above a hospital gurney, looking down in an out-of-body state, watching people trying to revive them, and they can, very often the people that can remember the experience will be able to tell you what the different people, medical people, were thinking at the time, let alone saying, and that has been verified with numerous of the people. And some of them actually have gone in an out-of-body state to other places in the hospital and then come back and describing what was going on elsewhere. Like one case, there was a sneaker out on a ledge outside the building of one of the rooms, in another part of the building, and they described that when they woke up, and nobody, I don't know whether this was the Dutch study or another, but in one of the studies, and finally they were such a pest about it, the nurse went and looked, and sure enough, here's a sneaker out on the ledge there, where they couldn't possibly have seen that when they were dead. But anyway, it came to really draw into focus the relationship between brain and consciousness. And in these NDE experiences in the Dutch study, they looked at all kinds of correlations, the ones that remembered and had these experiences and all of that. It had nothing to do with the degree of anoxia, they had data on that, nothing to do with the duration of cardiac arrest, nothing to do with whether it was an intubation, resuscitation, which was more complicated, or a standard one, nothing to do with how cardiac arrest was induced, whether it was induced or not for medical purposes, nothing to do with medication, no correlation with fear of death of the people, no before and afterwards, no correlation with prior knowledge of near-death experiences, nothing to do, no correlation with religion or standard of education. So this was a pretty interesting thing. In the Dutch study, half of them were aware of having been dead. 56 of them had positive emotions. 24% of them had out-of-body experiences. 31% experiences of moving through a tunnel. 23% communicating with the light. 23% perceived colors at this time. 29% described celestial landscapes. 32% felt they met deceased relatives and friends. 13% went through life reviews, and 8% of them perceived a border that they couldn't cross, or didn't cross. Anyway, there were subsequent studies, one in the U.S. And 2 in Great Britain, for a total of 562 patients, and no physiological or psychological explanation existed for the NDE in any of those studies as far as the people who did the studies were concerned. The NDEs all occurred during cardiac arrest, and cardiac arrest involves, in every case, loss of all brain function. So von Lommel's conclusion was consciousness is not localized in the brain. And there are other pieces of evidence that we could go on which are consistent with that conclusion, that in fact the brain is not the center of consciousness or the source of consciousness. It is something that, if you're perceiving brain activity, it is true that there's consciousness occurring, but if you're not perceiving brain activity, it is not proof that consciousness isn't occurring. And so the existence of consciousness associated with a person is not localized in the brain. All of the evidence that you've seen violates both the classical physics and the mainstream scientific teaching. You're seeing the tip of a giant iceberg of data and of phenomena that all illustrate the same paradigm. In the next segment, we'll talk about, okay, what is that paradigm? How does it work? What is the physics? What's really going on, and how does everything work? And in that one, I will not be offering you scientific proof. I will just share with you my understanding of it. The first three, those are all scientifically proven, and we can furnish you references. You can go look at the original scientific data, papers, books, photographs, etc. on your own if you care to research any of those things. They all are well-established scientific fact. So now the question is, okay, how can that be? And we'll talk about that next.